Hello and welcome to Upper Pen. My name is Dakota, and today I'm talking with Amiee Gibbs about her novel, The Carnival of Curiosities. Thank you, Amiee, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Dakota.
So, for folks who don't know what it's about, can you give a little rundown of the book?
Yeah, basically it follows this carnival. It's Victorian London, about 1897. Oh, I'm sorry, 1887. Oh my God, I'm just bad. And the carnival consists of various what you call human oddities, I suppose, in today's terms. Um, but the leader of the troupe, one Aurelius Ash, has the propensity of being able to make certain wishes come true if you're willing to pay a certain price. Which one character in particular, Odilon Rose, who is really considered one of the most notorious men in London, comes calling because he has a problem. He has a ward who is deathly ill. There's no cure. So he's hoping that he can find a fix for her at any price. But he also has ulterior motives because there's long lingering past actually between the Ash and the Rose family. And then along the way, there's a little burgeoning romance that begins to start between one of the characters and the ward in question, which just sets off a whole slew of issues along the way. But there's also just the magical acts. It's very much found family really comes into play with this. There's also a little bit of murder, some mystery, as well as you're sort of unraveling the story. A large basis that inspired me was actually Dickens' Bleak House, that I kind of wanted to play into, as well as my interest in the concept of the Faustian bargain. So that played a big role as well. So a lot going on, but it was just a joyous little thing to write that I kind of did little spur of the moment.
You say little, but this book is it's got so much going on, and it it blew my mind. And I was like trying to explain it to my fiance, and he's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I'm like, you just need to read it.
I know. When it came to trying to figure out like an elevator pitch, it's like one of the hardest things ever for something like this because there are so many layers that I've never been able to really master that. And it's kind of embarrassing when I get from this file. Tell me about your book. It's like, well, here's what kind of goes on. So yeah, so I apologize if I kind of wander my way along with this. It just yeah, it kind of they ticked off a lot of things as I was with the book of just things that interested me from the Victorian era, which is just so much you can draw from and you can invent as well. There's a couple little elements, a little tip of the hat to the steampunk in some ways, but also just the societal, looking at just the difference between the haves and the have-nots, which is so blatant, which we're kind of still seeing today still. And then just the where women's roles were, basically, there were certain expectations put upon women that you were to marry well, or at least attempt to marry above your station if you could. Like, in researching that, just seemed like the level. It's like the upper class wanted to marry into the aristocracy, the middle class wanted to marry into the upper class, so on and so forth. So it was interesting to see that kind of play out. But just having a career or having any sense of independence yourself was not encouraged. That just you were just basically, this is your role. You're going to be wife, mother, angel of the house, so to speak. So I kind of wanted to subvert a few of those along the way, through the characters who, just by being different, allows them to be truer to themselves. And so kind of playing with a few tropes in that arena was a lot of fun to do. And then just I love the extravagance, if you will, of being able to just play with language, play with description. I owe a lot of that to writers like Angela Carter and Anne Rice, definitely, for just I felt I was allowed, I had the permission to just go for it in some ways. I mean, sometimes I had to pull back. I mean, 2 or 3 pages of description of one thing is like a little much. So so trying to just bring that down, and you know, that's what the editor is for. So thank you for that.
Well, it was funny because when I was reading it, I was like, oh, this feels very much like a Victorian novel. Like
Hmm.
there are these gothic elements
Hmm.
and the language that you use even is like Victorian-esque
Hmm.
language. So I had to like look up a bunch of words and I was like, what the hell does this mean?
Yeah.
I get it through context, but like I haven't seen the word chilblains used in like a dozen years at least.
Yeah, and that's also like it's an homage to what's come before as well. Very much played into that, just having fun with it. I think, yeah, usually even back in school, that was kind of the joke that when I turned a paper in, you had to grab the dictionary at the same time. So that kind of has always stayed with me.
That's a wonderful thing to have, though, is like finding the right word is always something that, like, I really like literary fiction because they
Mhm.
use language in such a way that, like,
Mhm.
and seeing you use it here is just so magical. I loved it so much.
Oh, thank you. No, I mean, language, you have to, to the writer, I mean, is basically like the paintbrush to the artist. It's
Yeah.
you have this wonderful tool. Let's use it and play with it. I mean, I definitely have admiration for writers, like Cormac McCarthy and such, who can do such a succinct phrasing,
Yeah.
um, and to really evoke something. But if you look at really how he crafted the words, they were carefully picked. They weren't just simply thrown on the page. He was able to just evoke as much emotion and as much horror in many ways in his settings, the brutality, and just such a way that he's still usually using his palette, but in more muted terms, I suppose, and just in the careful choosing of his words. I don't think he didn't waste a word. Um, so with something like this, it allowed you to be a little more florid in the usage. So I think that's why I like that setting very much, because I could play with that and kind of honor the past in that way.
And it fits so well. So when I first picked up the book, I was like, oh my God, it's a book about carnivals in the
Hmm.
late 1800s. I need to read this. I was just like immediately drawn to this idea. And then, of course, there's the Faustian bargain happening the whole time. So I love playing with those things, but you brought in so many things too. Like there's a murder mystery, there is uh unrequited love from one of the
Hmm.
characters.
Hmm.
So like I was just impressed. And then the language on top of that was just like, wow, you just made such a rich world.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm imagining the setting came naturally to the story just because of the type it is.
Yeah, very, very much so. When I first started this, it actually, I first started in 2012 is when it first got the inkling for it, and it was part of actually a NaNoWriMo challenge. We had my little writers group. Basically, I had been working on a contemporary mystery at the time, and um, what had happened is I think a lot of us kind of got a little stale in our writing at the time. You know how it can happen, life intervenes, you kind of lose some of that spark. So a friend of mine suggested that let's all just try something completely new. Just throw out, don't even look at what you're working on now. Just do something completely new and see what we come back. We weren't going to play by the rules of you have to have 50,000 words. That wasn't going to happen. So I love the idea of just trying something fresh just to get the juices going again. So I was thinking, all right, what are things that I like? What do I love? Yeah, well, I love the Victorian era. So much to work with there. I've always been enamored of the concept of the Faustian bargain. Really, more so the first time I ever heard Robert Johnson's Crossroad Blues. The first time I ever heard that song, that just enthralled me. And then later on, as I got older, when I read Faust, then it all kind of came into play. Um, I love the idea of the sideshow. It was always such an interesting aspect, both on the public stage, but also at the time during the medical field where they had, anomalies, and they would basically put these people on display, like, here, look at this sort of thing. And it was another form, so I kind of wanted to play a little into that in the character with Columbine, with how she comes into play. um, so really, I had all the elements, but I had no story. I had nothing I could play with in that regard. So it was like about like 11 days in, and I'm still sitting here thinking, oh, I've got nothing, whereas my friend, she's already got 3 chapters. I'm like, okay, what am I doing here? And then it makes no sense to me, even now when I think about it, but I had gotten a phone call, and it was my ex-boyfriend at the time. We had split up like about a year before, so hadn't really been in touch, but he called me kind of like out of the blue, and he just kind of like say, hey, how you doing? He said, well, I have news, I'm engaged. And I'm like, okay, you felt the need to call and tell me this, okay, great. So, and it was after I hung up with him that I was sitting at my desk here at work, and a name popped into my head, and that name was Aurelius Ash. And I don't know where it came from, who he was, or anything, but I typed it up, and I liked the way it looked on the page, and I kind of looked up the name, the meaning behind the name, and the meaning for Aurelius is the golden one. So that kind of gave me something to play with in that. And shortly thereafter, I started characters kind of started coming into play. Before I really had the story, I started seeing, okay, well, here's Lucy, and who is he? And Lucy is, from Lucifer, Firebringer, Lightbringer. So, and everyone started to kind of come together that way. And then I just sort of had this vision. Another thing that I really have a weird thing for is I like shipwrecks. I like it seems weird, but like kind of like natural sort of things, not in battle, so to speak, but just weird things that happen. And there was this one that had happened, is I think it was the USS Arctic. It had been a collision, but I love the description of the ship. It had like the wheels, the paddle wheels on it. There's also a steamship, but it did cross Atlantic, and I just had this image of this ship coming onto the Thames and just barreling through the night. And then that's kind of how I started to think, oh, this could be a way they travel around to different places. So once I kind of had that was actually my opening scene for the longest time before I had the other scene precede it. But that kind of was the opening, and then it just sort of built from there. I just started kind of researching Suffolk and just the slums at the time, and just really being able to craft so much from that. The theater being formerly an old debtor's prison, it has a history of itself. But with that, it was inspired partly by the physical shape of the Globe Theater, which is right there in Suffolk, but also the idea of the panopticon that Jeremy Bentham had created, that his idea of just always being watched. Someone's always watching. So I kind of like to play with that as an idea, but also as the physical aspect of the building. And then everything just started to build from there, as far as the world starts to come together. So yeah, history really was a lot of fun to delve into and play with.
That sounds really cool, though, that you had the setting, and then you got a cast of characters, and then you're like, I need a story.
I need a story. And then that just, I immediately, it was very easy to turn to the Faustian bargain, but then it was this kind of, it really, in the past, when I've kind of thought of stories, I kind of had a definite beginning and a different ending. I just need to get to the middle. With this, I didn't have anything. I was really building it chapter by chapter as I went along the way. So this was like a new experience in that regard. But as things were forming, I was seeing things a few steps ahead. So I was able to really have an end goal. And the way this ends, I wanted it to be left open, that there was still possibly, because there's a lot of unfinished business to be attended to still in the background, that hasn't really come into play. Things have been hinted at, but it hasn't really formulated yet. So I'm hoping to do something with that.
That's great to hear, because I was like, please have another book. Please do another book.
I thoughts are in motion. We'll say that.
So I love how you play with the Faustian bargain here, because it's not like, in my mind, Faustian bargains are very much, you want this thing and then you get it in a way that's negative, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's never really a positive.
Right.
But here the there is no negative or positive really. Aurelius Ash is very much like it is what you make of it, like
Exactly.
so I loved that whole like thread throughout the book. And I loved that it was like every character had moments of your life is what you are making it, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, with that, it was, I really kind of looked at the consequences. There's always a repercussion to anything you do. Whether you look at it as being the butterfly effect in many ways. But yeah, I mean, if you go to someone, if you strike a deal, if you want to have this, I want this much money, or I want love, or I want this, then you're asking something of the universe, you're asking something of the world. And you have to be prepared for that world to respond in one way or another. It's either going to be, yes, you're going to have this, but what you're doing today, what's going to happen like a generation from now? It's going to affect everyone who comes after you, everyone you encounter. So I kind of wanted to look at the long term effects. It's like you might have the immediate, but something's going to happen. There's going to be a knock on that door at some point in time where it's like, hey, you know, is this really what you had wanted all along? It's like, so I that was something that I really wanted to look at, um, and just how corrupted you know you yourself can be without really realizing just how it's been you. It's like, but everyone's affected by it. If your father's like in a Ponzi scheme or something like that, the kids are going to be affected by that at some point in time. So it's really kind of looking at just that slow decay, that slow rot that kind of creeps in, and that's kind of what the Rose family was. I mean, they were this, they started out, they could have been perfectly fine, if they had patience, but it wasn't going to be. They wanted it now, 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 and those repercussions kind of come into play. But then with Aurelius, is like he's never been forced to look at that. So having Charlotte come into the realm, he's like, wow, for the first time, he's actually seeing, quote unquote, the collateral damage to what he has allowed to happen, or if he, you know, aided in doing it in his own way by, leading them down this path. But whether or not he's not going to be able to learn from that, because that's just not his nature, obviously. But he kind of recognizes, and in his own way makes amends in an unusual fashion, but in the only way I think that he can, which is still going to be detrimental. Um, but at the same time, it is another act in Charlotte's life. She is alive, but it's maybe not in the way she would have intended, or really in the way Odilon had wanted it. So,
Right. But so I loved this moment in the book where Aurelius is realizing that his actions have
mhm,
consequences beyond the people that he intended to have
mhm,
consequences. So like Charlotte being like
mhm.
a tertiary person.
Yes.
And even then he's like, but if these people hadn't have made this choice, she would have never been in this position, right?
Mhm, mhm,
Uh, and then I don't, he like rationalizes it so well. And then you have Lucien, who's like, I did something awful as a child, and now I can never have a full life. And so he's like the direct opposite of like just feeling this guilt for
mhm.
something that really was not his doing and couldn't.
Exactly.
Uh,
Exactly. Exactly. He doesn't, I think, because of what Aurelius is, he has a more clinical look at things. It's like, this is just how it is. This is my life. Where, Lucian, he has that human side in a way that he's affected differently. So he has that aspect that he can see, like, look, I get what you're doing, but there's going to be a reckoning. There's going to be something along the way here that, you're, it's not always a good thing. And so that's why he voices concerns. He does have that brooding aspect to him that he's just can't, like, it's a lot to take in for him. And I think he tries to follow in Aurelius's footsteps in some ways, but it's just not, he's not fully able to. I think that's the human side of himself comes into play, that in that regard, that he can't quite be as callous, I suppose, in his views. And so that's just the battle between the two of them kind of going on. And that's just the way they are, no matter how much they try to convince Lucian that he's not at fault. This is not just, this is what happened, this is the result, but he can't let go of that. So he has that sympathetic, empathetic feel going on with him.
And it makes it really easy for like Charlotte to find him as like the attractive person in her life, like not just physically, but like emotionally. And he seems like a good complement to her past. So
he definitely, through his own initial traumas, he can understand her in a way that others haven't. I mean, I think that so many of the characters are very much damaged in one way or another, that within this realm, she has found that harmony, that family that she can go to, who get her and they don't expect anything more of her, so to speak. But at the same time, she does have a certain role to fill. you come to find out, and she fits it very well.
She does indeed. And I loved the end where she is just fully embracing herself now.
Yeah.
That's why I wanted more. I was like, I need to know.
Yeah. I mean, and there's still outlying characters who have their just desserts to come, in one way or another. And that so there's still a lot to play with there in that world. So it's my plan to return to that.
That's so one of the things that I really thought was important to the story was how you broke up the points of view. And it wasn't like a even split. Not everybody got the same amount of page time, which I really appreciated, because I did not want to stay in Odalyn Rose's mind for any longer than I had to.
No one does.
How did you choose, like, who went where in the story, really? Like, whose point of view?
I think a lot of it kind of sort of fell naturally, with the natural rhythm of the story itself. There were stories that I wanted to tell, and I felt that focusing, having certain little spotlights on the various troop members, having that little moment with Angelique, or having that little moment, with Harlequin, who I adore. It's so fun. Just having those little moments come into play just helped, because so much of it is effective to Lucian, and really just how their relationship with him is, really showing that background and how close the family is. That was very important, I think, to have that background. Whereas within the Rose factor, they're a bunch of nasty people. Let's face it, at the end of the day, they do have their issues and quirks there. But I just felt it was important to kind of highlight certain characters, because there are so many, that definitely Aurelius needed the screen time, Lucian needed it, Charlotte, and Odalyn, to the degree on that side, had to have his share of the time. But I think bringing Florence in, as this other very strong feminine character, but strong in a totally different way. She has her own way of doing things, and while she's which I found interesting as she was developing, is that she's fits the expectations of the Victorian lady in more ways than any other character in this, despite her road that she travels at the same time. But she played the wife, she did everything she was told, and she's very resentful. And that was something I wanted to bring out, just her resentment, her envy, in a way of, despite everything Charlotte's been through, Charlotte has more freedom than Florence has ever known.
Right.
And it's kind of like just showing those moments. So having those little moments between those two I think helped really show the two sides and the differences within that society, because Charlotte essentially came from nothing, and she's gained in many ways everything. Florence, who had everything, we see how she winds up. Um, so that was another thing to kind of play with in that regard.
So I really do love the female characters and how they subvert and meet expectations of the
Mm-hmm.
time. And I really thought Florence was going to be like, because in the beginning she's introduced as someone who's like madly in love with Luce, and
Mm-hmm.
she like follows him around, which is super creepy.
Uh-huh.
So I thought she was going to be like this, like the rule breaker of the expectations, but she really was the person that fit the most into societal expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And like it was just funny because I was like, oh yeah, she's gonna be the one.
No, I mean, in some ways, she kind of breaks those rules, obviously.
Yeah.
But for the most, though, she kind of really sticks for all of her bravado that she shows, in her flirtations and all of that. At the end of the day, she does what she's told, and it's just in some ways that's kind of heartbreaking because she does have you can see that vitality she has within her that she's just had to repress all this time. If she had been allowed just a modicum of freedom to kind of just pursue life a little bit rather than doing, what her brother wanted or what the family expected her, because she's a Rose. She has a no matter what you do, it comes back to our name, our reputation, and that was definitely another thing I wanted to kind of play with, just how much you know reputation and your status defined you. There were cases and such, in history where if someone stepped out of line, or they followed another path, if any evidence of that came back, that's kind of where the blackmail comes in. If you have that, we don't think much of it today so much, like, oh, someone wrote a naughty letter, oh boy, big deal. But back then, that could ruin a status completely, not just your personal status, but it's going to affect the family as well. It's like, oh well, and if you just one toe out, over that bound, and it's like there was so much pressure to just fit within and always do what was right. So Florence is very much dances around that edge in her pursuit of going to the theater and being uber flirtatious and doing this and doing that. That's her little rebellion, but it's never fully fulfilled. She if she had wanted to, she could have run off at any time, but she couldn't do it. At the end of the day, she just couldn't do it.
She likes the status too much.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not just that her brother is pushing her to do these things, but like she likes the fact that she can go to the theater
Mhm.
and nobody's going to question her about it. And
Mhm.
like,
Exactly.
so I loved
Yes.
like her whole line, her like subplot was
Mhm.
fantastic.
She was fun. I had a lot of fun with her. Really, I tried to look to the classic female villains, and really to try to filter a lot of that into her. Um, I have to say, in many ways, like Crimson Peak definitely played in the back of my mind with her, and just being that sort of here I am on one side, but here I really am kind of thing. And there's so much more I want to do with her.
So I loved that there are so many threads in this book, and a lot of it comes down to like choosing who you want to be in the world that you're in.
Mhm.
And I thought that was like my favorite theme, because Luce is very much like fighting against like, oh, well, do I want to be what Aurelius Ash needs me to be, or
Mhm.
who he wants to be as a person. And
Mhm.
Charlotte is very much in the same boat. And then all of the side characters feel like they are too. And it's just magical to see the like so many coming of self stories at once. And I was like, oh gosh, you did it so well.
Thank you. Sometimes you worry if you like have too many balls juggle, in the air at one time. But I think because thematically just looking at it in that regard, that's just natural. It's like everyone is going through that same thing.
Yes.
where, he said this is part of the process of being human, is constantly trying to find where you belong, who you really are. You're at the same time, you're also kind of filling expectations in so many ways. It's like, you're supposed to be this person, you're supposed to be that person. Well, what if I want to be this other person? Or what if I want to do this? That's why people sit back and think, oh, I never thought so and so would do that.
Right.
And it's only because they had that little moment. And then there's always that fear. If you do, kind of step outside of yourself a little bit, how is that going to be received? Are you going to be accepted? Are you going to be ostracized? I
Yeah.
think it's just that moment of self-discovery of, who do I want to be? And I don't think it ever really changes. We're always growing, we're always changing. Um, and I just think I kind of want to kind of reflect some of that. It's like, this is your life. You got one shot. You're gonna have to start doing what makes you happy, or you're always gonna wonder what if. And you hate that what if, you know, kind of moment.
Yeah. It seems like Odilon is the only one who thinks he is exactly who he should be. And then there's one other character. It's Luce's friend, who's the prostitute, who seems very self-assured. And she's
Yes.
like, this isn't who I'll be forever,
Hmm.
clearly. But like, while I'm here, I might as well do it. Like,
Exactly. Yeah.
um,
Exactly.
I loved her like self-assurance. And even she was like trying to guide Luce to like do what you need to do.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. 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 I mean, that's when you're looking at the history, the a majority, so many, prostitutes at that time were kind of thrown into it because they had
right.
no other outlet. I mean, they had no way to make money, because women couldn't have the property, they couldn't have this, they couldn't have that. If they, you know, if the husband died and he didn't leave much behind, here's someone who might have like 3 4 children. How do I support them? It's either the street or, you know the workhouse, or something in that regard. So many women who you wouldn't anticipate fell into this, like, well, this might not be forever, but it's what it is now. And Sylvia, she's kind of embraced it. It's like she didn't have any other outlet. It's like, all right, this is what I am. Here we go. And and I like her because she doesn't complain about it. I mean, she is very matter of fact, um, but she's also fiercely loyal too. Um, no matter what, she's always Luce is really the one person who she really looks at as an ally. Um, she doesn't think he's different, and she's never treated him as being different despite who he is. And that was something else that I really enjoyed, that she's non-judgmental.
I love all of these characters so much. And normally I have a hard time when there's such a large cast of
Hmm.
characters, but like everybody is so well developed. Even Odilon's little secretary minion guy, who I wanted to smack so bad so many times.
Yeah.
Um, like these characters that you would normally see as like blips in stories, you give so much life to them here.
Yeah, I
So
mean, yeah, that was just, again, that was me enjoying myself a lot of the time, because I like all the characters, no matter. And it's like, I could push somebody, I could make you the most miserable creature, and I love this about you. And so I had a lot of fun with that. I mean, you know, crafting Georgie, he's so near and dear to my heart. He's just so darling, and you just feel so horrible for what happens. And but then that's that great rallying point where
yeah.
you really see, we're not going to have this. This is not going to happen ever again. Um, so that was it's kind of fun to play with that, because it brought out then those elements in the other characters at the same time. So
Yeah. And then you have these scenes that are so cinematic in the theater. And I was like blown away by how well you like moved their performances. So each of the characters in the
mhm.
carnival has like a special talent, and
Yes.
uh, you give us those performances, and I loved it so much.
Oh, good. You always worry if it's like, is it Is it too much? Did you go far enough? What am I doing here?
No, it was perfect. And they just felt like such rich moments too. Like even though they were on stage performing for a crowd, it felt like Lucian was like being who he was and like for real. And
Hmm.
everybody thought it was an act. And I loved those moments.
Yeah, that those moments were very freeing. Excuse me, for those characters, and that's like the one point where they can really just let loose. That's who they are. They you know Luce can do his fire. He's not going to be scolded for it. It's like when but his mother did not want him to do this, but she was terrified. And now it's like he has permission. He's given himself permission to do this, and you can see he enjoys it. He enjoys creating the images and everything. Um, and then you've got Columbine and her aerial acrobats. Just again, she's such a hard shell in so many other ways. This is one moment where she's free, and I think when she's doing her act and she's doing it for one person, she's doing it for Georgie.
Mhm.
That I thought was just I loved doing that. To have that moment between those characters, even though they don't speak,
Yeah.
she's up there for him, and I was just really something to play. I really played into with that.
Well, there are just so many elements in this book that are so perfect and so well done. Like, I hope this book does so well that you write 10 of them.
Well, fingers crossed.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Amiee.
Well, thank you for having me for this great conversation. Yeah.
The book, The Carnival of Curiosities, is out July 11th. So if you haven't pre-ordered or if you haven't purchased it, go purchase it. It is fantastic. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much and have a great day.
Okay.